They're going to do an awesome job. And then I think we'll do one more week 4, because I don't think we're going to get to the Reformation tonight. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to cover the entire medieval period. So here's a timeline for those of you who are visual like me, so you can see it mapped out. The first week, if you were here, we covered like basically Jesus' resurrection through like kind of the 300s, early 300s. And then last time we made it like 90 more years to like the roughly 400s. Today, we're going to try to cover the 400s all the way through the 13 or 1400s. No big deal. We're going to go from 90 years last time to 1,000 years this time. So when we talk about the Middle Ages, this is going to be like a little bit of a history lesson as well. It might bring back some of those middle school lessons that you went through. But you guys know this, I think. But like as we're going through history, they don't say like, okay, well, the early antiquity is over and now we're starting the Middle Ages, right? Like there's not like a clean division. So usually historians, what they'll do is they will kind of look at big moments. When did things really seriously shift in the world? And one of those is the fall of Rome in 476. And really it's the fall of the Western Roman Empire. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So that's 476. And the Middle Ages goes all the way roughly till the Renaissance in the 1300s. Late 1300s, you have the Renaissance beginning, and then a couple centuries after that, we have the Reformation beginning. So we're going to kind of cover this next time, or in a month from now, we'll cover the Reformation, because we want to do a fair time on the Middle Ages. Because if you think about it, the Christian church has existed for almost exactly 2,000 years, right? This is 1,000 years. So literally half of church history happens in the Middle Ages. I realized that as I was thinking about it. I was like, we cover like the early church, Council of Nicaea, and then if you're a Protestant, we do the Reformation, and then modern day, right? And we kind of jump over 1,000 years of our own history in the medieval period. So that's what we're going to try to cover today. So a couple things as we jump in. Medieval period. Number one, I'm going in reverse order here. We don't want to call it the Dark Ages. Are you guys familiar with this? How like in the past couple decades, there's been a shift away from calling it the Dark Ages. Some of you were nodding. Yes, no. Because they like that was kind of a name given to it by people in the Renaissance, where they said, oh, nothing happened back then. We are the ones rediscovering philosophy and reason and art and culture and bringing this back after like so many dark ages, right? And so they kind of derogatorily gave it the name the Dark Ages, and we want to kind of avoid that because so much happened over those 1,000 years. We're probably not even going to cover a tiny fraction of it tonight, but we're going to try, right? So we want to call it either the medieval period or the Middle Ages. Some people even don't want to call it the Middle Ages because that implies that it's between two important ages, right? It's between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, and it's just, it was filler, you know? But no, like if you look at how they saw the world, they were constantly having debates and realizations and discoveries. All sorts of political things are happening, and like every age feels like it is the apocalyptic age. So we read the book of Revelation. How many of you were here during the Revelation talk when we had the professor come in? Like one thing I don't remember if he said this or not, every period in human history ever has thought that it is the apocalyptic age, right? Like we think the book of Revelation is about us and things happening in Israel today. In the 1950s, they had the Cold War, and they said this is apocalyptic, right? In the 1800s, they had reason and philosophers and people saying like, oh my gosh, everything's changing, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, this is the apocalyptic age. And you go through every single century in history, they thought it was the apocalyptic age. So same with the Middle Ages. They also thought that they were on the cutting edge, which they were, like that was the present to them. That was the cutting edge of time, and things were happening, things were shifting around. And then we have what I said earlier. We're going from the fall of Rome in 476 through the Renaissance. we might get to this later on. I don't know. We'll see how far we get. But the Black Death, if you're not familiar, that's what prompted the Renaissance. So we'll get to that in the later tonight. And as always, feel free to ask any questions that you have as we're going through. I don't want anyone to be lost, or if you don't know the meaning of a word or anything, feel free to raise your hand or ask your small group people whenever you guys chat. And I'll try to throw those in every 15 minutes just so that nobody gets left behind. Yeah, any questions or anything so far? Or are we doing good? Yeah, good? All right, let's keep going. So medieval period. Here's 4 characteristics that really define the medieval period. Number 1, we're going to see papal authority expands bigly. That's the academic term. Expands a lot, right? Because you go from, I should have put this map earlier, but we have, early on in church history, the first couple centuries, you have like kind of 5 main hot seats of church authority. And that's going to be Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, right? And they're all kind of like fighting and kind of jockeying to be the first among equals, if you've ever heard that term. These bishops and those 5, they're called episcopal sees, which is a fancy way of saying like kind of the place that they had jurisdiction over. They're all kind of trying to be first, the head of the church, like who's the true head. Obviously, when we think of the Pope now, we just think of Rome, the Roman bishop, the Pope of Rome, Bishop of Rome. That didn't come about for several centuries after Jesus, right? And I know that we have some Catholic friends here tonight, and I'm going to try really hard not to offend them, but this is we're studying the Middle Ages in the church, so, we'll see how it goes. But during this time period, we're going to see the papal authority, the authority of the Pope, is going to expand dramatically. And we're going to look at some stories of how that happened, and times it went well, and times it didn't go as well, and it's going to be interesting. There's a constant struggle between political and religious power. There's kind of constant back and forth, to the point that a lot of people would say that by the time you get to like 1000 to the 1300s, roughly, the Pope is the most important and most powerful person in Europe, if not in the entire world, because of how they can send armies and they can do all sorts of stuff. And we're going to get into the Crusades a little bit and kind of cover a whole bunch of stuff that happens in the Middle Ages. So the papal authority and the way that they use it is very interesting to dive into, and we'll get into that a little bit. One of the main church concerns is what they call the mediation of grace. How do they get grace from God? How is that received to the general public, to the laity, the lay people? How do they receive grace? And one of the answers that they're going to come to in the 10 and 1100s is going to be through the Eucharist, through the actual body and blood, the actual presence of Jesus in those elements. We're going to see how that was kind of used for political purposes as well, which is messy and interesting. And then, so do you know what I mean when I say mediation of grace? How do you get that? No? So I was thinking about this. Maybe the best way to think of it, and you can say if you have a different metaphor that you think works better. In the Middle Ages, as I understand it, it seems like they see it like a hose, okay? So there's a system of hoses going all over the place, and the church is like kind of the main vessel through which you get the hose. And through the hose comes the water of grace, and that's how you receive it, running through all these different veins and arteries, which would be through like the Pope or the bishops, and then the bishops through the priests, and they distribute it to the people. So that's how you would get grace from God. And that was predominantly through the masses and through the Eucharist. Yeah.
So you're completely right in the sense that it was seen as like a hose, but it was primarily from Christ himself. So it wasn't mediated through the bishop or the Pope, or sorry, bishops or the popes. It was only through Christ that hose then could be distributed through the church.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting aspect. But you're right.
Yeah, good correction. Yeah. Actually, I learned this recently that, the term vicar? Vicar? That is short for like vicarious. Like this is them standing in the place of Jesus to distribute the grace, right? Like that's why they wear the fancy robes and hats and everything, is because they're vicariously acting out as Jesus, like to the church, to distribute grace and to give this to them. The problem is, and we'll see this in a little bit, but we'll jump ahead now. The problem is, if you have bishops with political interests or kings with spiritual interests, then you might have someone say, well, I'm going to cut off grace. I'm going to pinch the hose from going to your region. If I get in a fight with this prince who's over this little principality and I don't like the things he's doing, I'm going to cut off his ability to receive grace, like flowing through the church, to all of his people. So then what does that do? That throws all those people who live under that prince into a existential crisis of saying, am I saved or am I going to hell when I die? Because this prince and this bishop got into a fight. So you can see how this gets real messy real quickly when those are so intertwined, the way that they were for the Middle Ages. And then that's going to be a huge thing in a month from now when we get into the Reformation. That was one of the biggest things that the reformers are kind of addressing, is how is grace actually received? And that affects how they saw communion, transubstantiation. That's why Protestants are going to have a different view generally of the Eucharist than even Orthodox and Catholics. So, any questions? Did I lose some people on that? That was a lot right then. Makes sense? Everyone tracking? Christian?
Yeah, so since you mentioned papal authority there, can you remind us when the Pope became a thing, like when there was a bishop of Rome that sort of emerged above the others? Can you remind us about what time, like around what year?
Yeah. I'm going to have a different answer than a Catholic person, because a Catholic person is going to say Peter was the first pope, and that's just...
But you're the one teaching the class.
Yeah. I'm nervous. I'm scared of the Catholics. I know. I know. I know. What if I go into my closet tonight and there's Catholics hiding in there? But yeah. I think you're going to see that predominantly in the 400s, would be my opinion, late 400s, because Augustine is going to be really influential. Augustine is someone that both Catholics and Protestants want to claim as their patron saint, as a person who doesn't believe in patron saints.
Jerome wrote the incorrect Bible?
Yeah, they were contemporaries.
Okay, so that was sort of in that period of time
Yeah.
before the
Yeah.
Roman Empire
Collapsed.
Yeah.
Yeah, while it was probably actively dying. Yeah, so we talked about that last time, what Jessica's saying, because we have Jerome, who creates the Latin Vulgate, the widely used Latin translation of the Bible. And the reason that is so important is because that is the primary text or book that the Catholic Church is going to use from basically when it's written in the late 300s all the way to the Reformation. They're not necessarily always studying the Greek and Hebrew. In fact, I learned this recently too. Thomas Aquinas did not read Hebrew or Greek. He only read Latin. So what's that mean? It means he's dependent on Jerome's translation from the late 300s to understand Latin. So as Aquinas, probably the most influential theologian in the Catholic Church, at least in the Middle Ages, when he's creating his Summa Theologica, writing 5,000 pages of theology, he's basing it on the Latin translation from Jerome. He's also heavily influenced by Aristotle, Aristotelian philosophy, which we don't have time to get into tonight. We'll see how far we get tonight. But yeah, so you can see how if you have one translation of the Bible that your entire church is using, and they're building their doctrines for many centuries on that one translation, that's going to affect a lot of things. If they weren't going back to the Hebrew and the Greek and studying the original manuscripts, that affects their theology a lot. So a big thing that happens in the Reformation, jumping ahead a little bit, is they rediscover how to read Greek and Hebrew. In fact, you have the fall of Constantinople in 453. Is that what it is? So all these Greek-speaking people flee west. So then you have people who can read the Bible in Greek going to Rome, and they rediscover a lot of the original documents, the original New Testament languages, things like that. So a lot of what the Reformation is a philological rediscovery. You know that term, philological? It's rediscovering old or dead languages. So there's a lot of philology that happens in the Reformation. They go back to the original Hebrew and Greek and rediscover it after 1,000 years of Latin only. Makes sense? So back to Christian's point, that's kind of where Latin becomes the dominant language that they do the Mass in, they read the Bible in, and that really influences a lot of the later medieval period. Does that make sense? Lose anyone yet? We haven't even made it past the introductory slides yet. But this is good. I don't want anyone to be lost. I want us all to be on the same page moving in. So one important thing to know about the medieval period is they have a highly supernatural conception of the world. Okay, so they see God in everything. They see the supernatural in everything. If you were to get in your wagon and take your horse buggy like to the other side of town, you would pray and ask for protection and that demons wouldn't attack you before you got to the other side of town, right? Everything is supernatural. I have a quote from one of my professors. He says, "Any conception of the medieval mind which is unsupernatural would be incredibly alien to them. They saw God as imminently close to creation. That was their dominant frame, which is almost the inverse of ours." He says, medieval people, I don't know, lived as if God was real. So they really had this view, and I think it's really easy. I said this the very first night. It's easy for us to be like, look at those dumb people in the 4th century. You know, didn't they know about light bulbs, or didn't they know demons aren't going to throw their wagon off the road when they're riding along? Like, it was gravity, right? Like, it's easy for us to look at them and be like, oh, they're so dumb. They weren't dumb. They were as smart as you and I would be given this exact same context and circumstances, right? We are intellectual trust fund kids. We inherit so much. We live on this side of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and the Reformation and everything else that we take for granted. They don't. It doesn't mean they were dumb. It just means they were at their point in history living how they lived and thinking how they thought, and we can't fault them for that, right? They're not just a bunch of prehistoric bumpkins like, oh, those idiots, you know.
Just run.
No. Even they're all doing their best. So problems. If you want to remember this acronym, it's IIIISI. Very easy to remember. So these are some of the problems that, they didn't always necessarily see them as problems, but they have indulgences. If you've heard of those are kind of pretty famous. The indulgences, these were slips of paper, and they were sold, and they would buy time out of purgatory for sins that you did, which hadn't been atoned for. You could buy time out of purgatory for your deceased family members as well, so that you would shorten your mother's time in purgatory so that she wouldn't have to atone for as many sins that were unatoned for when she was alive, right? And this is how they built St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, by selling all the indulgences. And then we have the Inquisitions, which was a way that they said, there's too many heresies spreading all around Europe. We need to go and inquire and make sure everybody's on the same page, make sure that no heresy is spreading throughout our church. The problem is they do this violently, and they might torture someone until they say the right thing. They killed over 3,000 people over a couple centuries during the Inquisitions and tortured a whole lot more. There were a lot of awful things that they did during the Inquisitions. Fun fact, the last person to die from the Inquisition was in 1836, and he was a school teacher. And that seems pretty recent. We think about the Inquisitions as way, way older than that. But that was just less than 200 years ago that the Inquisitions, the last person died from the Inquisition. Investiture is a controversy where kings or princes appoint their own bishops. Why do you think a king or a prince would want to appoint their own bishop in the Middle Ages? Someone said? Control? Yeah. What's another problem with investiture? Yeah, Joe.
They could probably skew the words if it fits what they say as law or something.
Like the words of the Bible, you mean?
Yeah.
Or the teaching of the Bible? Sure. Yeah. Yeah, Kyler.
The bishop would then have some sort of something that he owes the prince. And
Yeah.
so he might feel compelled to
Sure.
rule in favor of the prince.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and we can kind of see as we go through all these that they're all kind of intertwined. That it's an ongoing struggle and dance between political power and spiritual power because the two were so intertwined throughout most of the Middle Ages, right? So we also have an interdict. This was invented, presented by at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. They came up with the idea of an interdict. What was his name? Pope Innocent III, I believe it was. He came up with an interdict, and basically it was this idea that we're not going to just excommunicate one person, we're going to excommunicate an entire region. So you remember the hose metaphor? That an interdict is how they would say, we're going to cut off the water from going to this entire region because we don't like this person or this bishop or this priest or whatever they're doing. And what does that do for the people? It puts all of them in a state of, what is my eternal fate all of a sudden if I can't receive grace from God? Because this pope cut off the grace because he got in a fight with my prince, right? Something like that. So kind of crazy stuff. And then one thing that's kind of cool that we're going to see if we get into Luther next time is a lot of Luther's project is actually pastoral comfort. If you're familiar with Martin Luther, you don't always think about him with comfort. But what he's trying to do is say, like, you're okay, even if there's some political fight with your king or your prince or your monarch, whatever, God still loves you and you can still receive grace from God. And he's trying to pastorally comfort people and say your eternal fate is not at risk here. You're okay. God still loves you. You can still connect with Jesus. You can still receive grace from God. Does that make sense? Because this is the mindset that so many people had for hundreds of years. Yeah? Make sense? Anyone lost so far? The last two, simony, I don't know how to say it, simony, the buying and selling of church offices. This is named after Simon the sorcerer in the book of Acts. If you remember, there's that story where he goes up to Peter. Is it Peter or Paul? He goes up to them and he says, hey, can you give me money so that I can do all these cool magic tricks too, right? And he's like, cursed are you, right? And he curses him. Because he was trying to give them money in order to operate in the church. And then the bonus, is going to be the rise of Islam. This might seem peripheral, but it's actually very central to the story of the church in the Middle Ages. It begins in about 610 AD. And it's going to heavily affect medieval theology, history, and thought, right? Because Christians have been the dominant religious force and political force for hundreds of years at this point, right? Because you have Constantine in 325 and Islam in 610, so almost 300 years. And suddenly they're being threatened with, wait, what's this happening? What's coming out of Medina? What is this? Who are these Islamic people, right? So there's kind of a tension that begins where they kind of have a natural enemy. Like, we don't want to see humans as our enemies, but for a lot of the Middle Ages, they do. Because what happens is a lot of the Muslims begin killing and persecuting a lot of the Christians. And that leads to the Crusades later at the end of the 1000s. Yeah.
You said that Islam began around 610?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's right.
Yeah, no.
Did it not sound right to you, or were you just clarifying?
I have no idea.
Oh. Yeah. Good thing you asked, because there's a timeline next. So, yeah, 610 is about the time that Muhammad begins receiving his revelations from the Archangel Michael. Yeah. And we have Michael here today with us. Yeah, so that's about 610. So we have 476, Western Rome falls. And then the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, as it becomes, is going to survive until about 1453. So about 1,000 years longer than the Western Roman Empire. In the year 500, Clovis becomes Christian. And this is important because he's kind of the king of the Merovingians, which kind of fills some of the power gaps left when the Western Roman Empire crumbles. Are you guys tracking with this? Kind of? Yeah, Sarah?
For all the problems that were listed in the previous slide, is that like the entirety of the timeline, all those problems fallen, or
No.
where exactly do all those problems, where are they falling on the timeline?
Yeah, I should have been more clear with that, huh? A lot of it is going to begin around this time. Like here it says indulgences were created.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got you.
Some of them begin earlier. So simony, it begins in the book of Acts, technically, right? That's who it's named after. Simon the sorcerer, trying to buy a church office. So some of it is kind of random. Some of it's ongoing. But yeah, we have the indulgences here, the Inquisition here. What were the other I's? The interdict is invented in 1215, where he says, why excommunicate one person when you can excommunicate a kingdom, right? And then this begins in the 5th century, the investiture controversy. Say that 5 times fast. Yeah. But as one thing that you can see here as this is kind of moving on is, maybe you can't see it, but the power is beginning to kind of coagulate and snowball, the power that the church has. Because keep in mind the first night where we talked about church history, where you have a random group of former Jews being fed to lions. And that's all Christians are. And within several hundred years, you have these barbarians, as they were called by Rome, becoming Christians, and then filling in the power gaps when Rome falls, so that like Rome falls and the church kind of gets even bigger at this point. Because you had Constantine, who was the emperor, made Christianity legal, and then it becomes even bigger and bigger and bigger as the church itself gets more powerful. So we have Charlemagne crowned by the Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. I forget the order I did all these slides. We'll come back to all this. Any questions about this timeline as you're looking at it? I know there's a lot, Teresa.
I might have missed this in previous ones. Western Rome falls. Is this a political fall? Is this a physical military fall? Is this, what is that?
Yeah, good question. So Rome had been weakening for a long time. Before 476, the city actually got sacked by the barbarians, I want to say in 410 or 420. So like they thought for centuries Rome is impenetrable, right? And then the city gets sacked in the early 400s, and then later it gets completely dominated by the barbarians in 476. Yeah, and you know where that term barbarian comes from? Where,
The group of barbers, their culture, right?
they were given that name by Rome, though, by Romans, because when Romans heard them speak, they thought they were just saying bar, 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 bar. So they literally gave them that name, barbarians. They're just babblers, people who just say bar, 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 right? So it's really an insult to call them barbarians. But basically it meant anyone who wasn't Roman, like all these Germanic tribes that are around the Roman Empire. So Clovis is one of those. So when Rome as an empire kind of gets vanquished, it used to control the entire Mediterranean and more, right? And they had been shrinking, and then they kind of have a power struggle between Constantinople and Rome. Who's actually in charge of Rome? And then eventually the western half crumbles and falls in 476 to the barbarians. Invading forces from outside come. Jump ahead. So here's how it looks after it gets divided up. So you have all these little people coming in and setting up different kingdoms and different groups kind of vying for power. Because again, Rome used to be all this at its height just a couple hundred years before. You have the Visigoths here. I don't know if you can read all this. Odoacer, Burgundians, the Siagirius, and then the Franks up here. So they're all kind of struggling for power in the vacuum that Rome left. But who is kind of the unifying force across this entire area after Rome falls? The church, right? So you can see how the fall of Rome creates a power vacuum, and the church is kind of a stabilizing force within that. Added to the fact that a lot of these people are led by Christians, meaning everyone they rule over is also going to be a Christian. Yeah? So, where are we going? Yeah, so any questions about this? That was a good question, Teresa. Anything else? Cool. Yeah, Kyler.
Are you going to talk about the Eastern Roman Empire?
A little bit later on, yeah. Yeah, when we get to the East-West Schism. This is why I said we're going to try to cram 1,000 years into an hour and a half. It sounds crazy. So that's why it might seem like we're going a lot faster than the last time. It's because we are. Yeah.
How would we define what being a Christian means back then? Was this because of their king or whoever was in power, they had to follow their beliefs?
Mm-hmm.
Or was it just they just consider themselves Christians because they're in the vicinity of the king, who was also Christian?
That's a good question. And I don't necessarily want to speak for every person who ever lived during the Middle Ages, but a couple things about how they might see that. One thing was kind of the hose metaphor, I think, is fairly accurate, because just like everybody, they don't want to go to hell when they die. They don't want to spend more time in purgatory later on than they have to. They want to go to heaven when they die, and they want kind of that security, just like any of us do. So they're kind of listening to authoritative sources, who are their monarchs, their bishops, their priests, because a couple things to keep in mind. They can't read, a lot of them. They can't read. They don't have their own Bible. They can't go home and check what their pastor told them. So they're really reliant on the church to tell them, this is what's true, this is what's not, believe this, do this, right? But to your question, you're kind of asking, if a prince converts to Christianity, everybody under him also would convert. That was because, this might be a different topic, but Christianity is kind of the first religion in the sense that it's not directly tied to an ethnic group, because every religion before that was directly tied to who you were ethnically, right? You have the Norwegian gods that support the Vikings in their battles, right? You have Baal, who is the Babylonian god, or Shamash, or all these gods that are if we are winning the battle, that means our God is winning the battle, because it's our God. So Christianity is the first religion that's hey, go in and actually make other people Christians. So it's really hard for us to comprehend in a post-Christian, post-Enlightenment, post-secular world. Because for so much of human history, your religion was just who your people group were. Does that make sense? That's a much bigger conversation, but that's a really good question. But does that kind of make sense? Yeah, Daniel?
Yeah, I think my impression of what I've read is times when people make treaties or something, how we would do marriages for that kind of thing. When it comes to oh, is this place Christian now? It's they would just baptize the
Yeah.
But it was like, there would be this like political showing of we're all Christians now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like if you ask someone in the Middle Ages, like, did Jesus come to live inside your heart and be your personal savior? They'd be like, what the heck are you talking about? You know, like, and we should say that too, because that terminology is not in the Bible, right? If you were on the retreat, we talked about this a lot. I wanted to drive home this idea that the kingdom of God is what Jesus talks about. Jesus doesn't say, invite me into your heart and I'll be your friend, right? Like, it's bigger than that. But yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe some other night we'll wrestle more deeply into some of that history. So yeah, this is the map I should have had earlier, but these are just so you can see them visually. If you're visual like me, these are kind of the 5 main hubs of Christianity for the first couple centuries. And fun fact, in like the 500s, the Bishop of Baghdad, which would be over here, or maybe somewhere over there, the Bishop of Baghdad would have had more people under his provision than the Bishop of Rome. Because this is before Islam, right before Islam explodes onto the scene. The Middle East was like largely Christian. They were predominantly Christian. So the Bishop of Baghdad oversaw, they think, over 1 million Christians in his Middle Eastern region, which I think is cool. You know, that's going to change obviously drastically with the rise of Islam later on. But for a while, Christianity was like so widespread, so massive. Even within, I think it was the year 635, it reaches China. So you have missionaries within 600 years going all the way to the furthest east that they could and planting Chinese churches all the way out there. But when we think of Middle Ages, we don't usually think of Chinese Christians, but they were going all over fairly quickly for back then. Yeah, Michael?
I've heard that St. Thomas went to India, and the Syro-Malabar Church, it claims that St. Thomas was the one who converted them.
Yeah.
They're 2,000 years afterwards. And so it's a Syro-Malabar, Syrian church.
In India?
India.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of those legends of the apostles going all over the place and planting churches there. Like the Ethiopian going back to Ethiopia in Acts 8. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. And so like I mentioned earlier, Rome and Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, are going to have kind of a power struggle for who is kind of the true head of the church, or the first among equals, right? Because they're both kind of wanting that. And you can see, if you think about it, how that mirrors what's happening politically. How both these places also want to be the head of the Roman Empire at the same time. So there's a mapping on of human political powers onto church disputes. But anyway, let's move on. We have spent too long there. Any questions before we move on? Grams, any questions? This is my grandma, by the way. She came to see what it's all. She wanted to learn about Charlemagne, so.
Let's get to it.
Well, lucky you, Grams. Look at the next slide. So here we have the crowning of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800. Why do you guys think it's significant that the Pope is the one crowning the Holy Roman Emperor? He's seen as the direct line to God? The Pope is, you mean? Yeah. Yeah. Why else? Christian?
Oh,
Why is it significant?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, because then that gives the king authority then as another proxy basically to act on behalf of God. And that's why, because my authority comes from the Pope who crowned me, and his authority came from God. So in effect,
Kind of blurring those lines.
his rule
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
blessed by God or ordained.
Yeah. Yeah. Why else? What do you think? Joe?
Could it almost be like Christmas, how it's more celebrated, that holiday than Christ's birthday or newborn? Just like, I'm gonna remember this more in like doctrine.
You mean the reason that they chose Christmas Day for it?
Yeah.
That could be part of it, yeah. Yeah, talk about ego, if it's like Christ's birth is equivalent to my being crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Yeah, that's part of it. The other thing that I always think about is like, this implies that who is the one that has the authority to give the emperor his authority? The Pope. So who is more powerful than the emperor? The Pope. If he can give him the crown and put the crown on his head, right? Then who's the actual ruler of the entire Holy Roman Empire? The Pope. In a sense, right? We're going to see the ongoing struggle between those two. But I'll jump ahead to this quote by Voltaire, who said, "The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire." And he's saying this as someone who lives in the later part of the Holy Roman Empire, as it's kind of beginning to crumble. But here's kind of the story of the Holy Roman Empire in a nutshell, okay? So it kind of begins roughly Christmas Day, the crowning of Charlemagne, 800. He says, "We're bringing back the Roman Empire. It's been gone for 324 years. And now, for the first time, we are bringing the empire back," right? This is kind of the majesty that he was trying to evoke. Like, everybody wants to go back to Rome, hearken back to Rome, bring back the power of the Caesars, right? The problem is, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. This is how big it was for most of it. At its height, I mean. This is how big it was. In the year 800, shortly after 800, it was about this big. So modern day France, some of Italy, right, some of Germany, some outlying territories that it had. Here's how it looks just a couple hundred years later, around 1225. So as you can see, it's a collection of very tiny kingdoms and principalities ruled by princes, which kind of govern themselves, and they're all loosely held together by calling themselves kind of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, from what you know about the Roman Empire, did it ever really look like this? Not really. It was an empire ruled by the emperor who had complete control over the hierarchy, trickling down through his generals and leaders and the, what are they called? Why can't I think of the people who led, what? Something like that. It didn't look like this, right? So this is them trying to like scramble together power, but it's kind of loosely held together with Scotch tape, right? So that's why Voltaire says it's neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. So they're trying to recreate the majesty of Rome. It doesn't ever really fully realize itself. And you can even see here, like in all the crests, they have eagles. Why? Because Rome was like represented by eagles. And he's always crowned and looking very majestic and everything. And he's always holding what's called a cruciger. Or what is it? A globus cruciger. Have you ever seen that? It looks like the holy hand grenade. It's not a holy hand grenade. It's just a symbol of the cross over the globe, right? Jesus ruling over the entire world. But he's holding a sword in his other hand, which is kind of ironic, right? So he's like, I represent Jesus. I'm God's leader among men, but I also have a sword to kill people with, right? Or at least representing political power. I'm the king dominating over everyone. Yeah. Questions there? Anything? We'll go like 5 or 10 more minutes and then take a little break. Sound good? Any questions? You guys are like tired tonight.
No, we're interested.
Oh, okay, good.
Get confused.
Okay, it's hard to tell sometimes between tired or interested. Yeah. So this is Charlemagne. So they're trying to evoke the glory of Rome, which had been gone for hundreds of years at this point, right? But it doesn't really work. They have the Holy Roman Empire. It doesn't go nearly as big as they had hoped, and it kind of crumbles and falls apart because everybody wants to be emperor. Everybody wants to be king, right? Voltaire's quote. And this will lead us to the Great Schism. So we'll cover the Great Schism, and then we'll take a break. Sound good? And then afterwards, we'll come back and get into the Crusades a little bit. Yeah. So the Great Schism. In 1054, the year 1054, or sorry, I should start before that. Way before 1054, in the 4th or 5th century, you have what's called the Filioque controversy. Some of you are familiar with this, I know. Kyler's smiling. How would you define the Filioque controversy?
Do you want the biased version or the less biased version?
Give us the biased one. This is coming from somebody who self-identifies as Eastern Orthodox.
So the Nicene Creed is created and then affirmed as finished in the Council of Constantinople. They say that you cannot make any more changes to the creed, like it's done. And then in the West, they still have a resurgence of the Arian heresy. So to fight that heresy, they start adding "and the Son" to the creed to say that the Holy Spirit proceeds not just from the Father, but also from the Son. And the East says, one, that's not true, and two, you can't add something without a council, and also the councils in the past already said that it's finished, so what are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
And the Pope said, I have the authority to add this because I have that supremacy, and the East was like,
The Bishop of Rome
right,
at that
Bishop
time.
Rome.
Yeah.
And the East was like, where'd that come from? We've always seen you as first among equals, but not this ultimate authority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that starts to begin, if I remember, like in the 400s, 400s or 500s.
I think it's Charlemagne who does that in the 800s.
He may have made it official, but there's definitely records of it happening way before that too. Because what would happen is visitors, like on the Silk Road or traders, would go to the Western churches and they'd go to the Mass, they'd go and recite the creed. And these Western churches, like, they realize, wait a minute, why do they say "and the Son"? Just those 3 words. They're adding to the creed, even just 3 words. Because remember, the first couple weeks we talked about how important those creeds are, that they summarize, this is what you have to believe if you're a Christian. If you don't believe this, you're not really a Christian, right? And they're adding 3 words to it. And I've gone back and forth with my theology professors, like, why is this such a big deal? Why does it matter if the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son as opposed to just the Father? And, you know, you can fight with Kyler about that if you want. There are valid reasons on both sides, why it should, why it shouldn't. But regardless, if you as a universal church have established these are the exact words of the creed we're going to say, and then one party goes and starts adding to it, whether or not you think they're right or not, it's like, you shouldn't just do that without talking to them. So as early as the 5th century, you have some tension beginning between the East and the West, right? So theological tensions there. There's also political tensions, like we mentioned earlier. Both of them want to be the ruler of Rome early on, and then later they want to be the ruler of the church, because Constantinople was like the head of the Byzantine Empire, and later you have Rome as the head of the western half of the empire. They both want power. There's also a debate over whether we should use leavened or unleavened bread in the Eucharist, right? When we take communion, should we use leavened or unleavened? It was very important for them. Or sourdough. I don't know if they had that. Maybe they did. Then that would have solved all their problems. And then, of course, you have the language differences. So if you think about it, early on, Rome is reading the Bible in Latin, because last time we talked about Jerome's translation into Latin in the late 300s, early 400s. So if your whole church is reading the Bible in Latin, which is a very, what's the word? I can't think of words tonight. It's a very legal language. What's the word? There's another word I'm thinking of. A lot of laws are written in Latin. Latin is a language invented for writing laws, for maintaining order within Rome. And then you have Greek, which is much more poetic and flowy and okay with mystery and mysticism and mystical things. And they're trying to translate the Bible or read the Bible in both languages. there's slight doctrinal differences that begin to emerge from the West reading the Bible in Latin and the East reading the Bible in Greek. Does that make sense? Yeah, Tim.
Quick question on that. I was kind of wondering earlier. English, I feel like the English language has changed so much even in the last like 100 years. In the last 20 years, there's so much more slang. Sounds like Latin wasn't really like that though. It didn't. And I was curious, how much did that morph over time from the time of Jerome to the Great Schism? I mean, you're talking almost 1,000 years. Did Latin vary from when it was first written versus when the Great Schism happened, or was it still, were they like really strict on holding to like the same definitions of the same words?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd say it changed much less than languages now. Because if you think about it, in the 1400s, you get the printing press, which is going to distribute things much faster. That which is also, we'll get to this next time, contributes to the Reformation. Because Martin Luther's 95 Theses go viral within 3 months. Everyone in Europe has read his 95 Theses, right? So you have the printing press, which accelerates language change. And then now we have phones, and then we have the internet. So everything is just changing so much faster than it used to. So as far as I know, it wasn't changing that much, at least not by today's standards of how quickly things change. The other thing to know is Jerome's translation was called the Latin Vulgate. So that's where we get our word today, vulgar, which means of the common people. So that like your average, everyday, uneducated person could read it and understand it. So even back then, there were different tiers of the Latin language. There's like High Latin, which like nobles and educated people would read. And then there's the Vulgate, or the Vulgar Latin. So Jerome's translation was in the Vulgar Latin. I don't know if that contributes to your question at all. But I don't know how much it changed from the time it was written in 396 or something, to, the end of the Middle Ages. Probably some, but not much by today's standards because of the technological changes since then. Oh, thanks, Daniel. Okay, let's wrap this up, and then we'll take our intermission break real quick. So Latin and Greek is contributing to the tensions between the East and the West. So, in 1054, the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople simultaneously, mutually excommunicate each other. So it's kind of funny if you think about it. I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe the Bishop of Rome sent his messengers to that guy. He excommunicates the messengers, and they go back and tell him, and then he's like, okay, well, he's excommunicated, right? Or is it the other way around? Something like that. They both excommunicate each other in the same year, and then that causes a rift. But as we're going to see in just a minute when we come back, this isn't like they're all not Christians. Because when the Crusades happen, what's happening? You have the Western Empire going to rescue fellow Christians in the Holy Land. So it's not like they're not Christians at all. They're not Christians at all either, right? It's very complex. And I'm not an expert on any of that stuff. But this is loosely what happened. So we'll pause there. This is just, if you want to look at the fallout, this would be kind of who fell on the Western Latin-speaking side, and this would be who fell on the Eastern Greek-speaking side of the church. Before we break, any questions or anything? Yeah, Teresa?
I'm confused about the languages. Were the followers of Jesus mostly Jewish?
Uh-huh.
But how did the Bible get written in Greek instead of in Hebrew?
Good question. They mostly spoke either Greek and or Aramaic at this point in time. Like Jesus speaks Aramaic. When he's on the cross, he cries out in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, right? It's kind of like how if you go to Greece today, they speak Greek, but most of them also speak English. Because English is now the trade language in the world. That's kind of how Greek was. After Alexander the Great, the whole world kind of gets Hellenized, or at least Eurasia gets Hellenized, meaning they all kind of speak Greek. They all begin speaking and understanding Greek, and that enhances trade. So everyone speaks the same language. They can all trade with each other. So everyone knew Greek. I don't know how many of the Jewish people at that time knew Hebrew. Yeah, I don't know if they were literate. I don't know if they could read or write, but they spoke Greek. They probably spoke 3 languages. They probably spoke Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, if not a little Latin as well later on. So I don't know, but does that answer your question kind of? Yeah. Yeah, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew, but that's also written at least 1,000 years before in the United Monarchy period with King David. So a lot happens between the writing of the Old Testament and then Jesus coming, 1,000 years later. So, Maria, did you have your hand up too?
I'm just curious on the last image why you chose that. Did you explain the Greek?
Which one?
Go back one step.
This one? That was just decoration. I figured schism, knives. It looks hardcore. Yeah. Okay, take 5 minutes and then we'll come back and get into the crusade. All right, let's bring it back. So did anyone have any questions that came up as you were discussing or thinking?
Why is the black out?
Why is the what? This? It's just style, different styles. I know, the black part is the water. No, anyone watch Arrested Development? Yeah. The blue part is the water. The blue part is the land. The blue part is the land. Yeah. I know that you were all discussing nothing but theological history during the break, so did any questions come up or anything? Yeah, Kyler?
Actually, Michael and I solved the Great Schism.
Wow. Nice. Back in communion. Nice. Did you figure out how to accurately communicate about the mystery of the Eucharist?
Yeah, it just turns out that English is like the best.
True. Yeah, the Anglicans will love that. Nice.
And sourdough bread, right?
Yeah, sourdough bread, English, perfect. We are the new Rome. That's what they say. America is the Rome of the far west. Yeah, anything else besides that? Yeah, Tim?
It's kind of a random question, but I don't remember if we touched on this when we went over Revelation, but I know I grew up being taught that like the 7 churches in the first couple chapters of Revelation correlate to different times in church history. Are you familiar with that? And do you feel like there's any validity to it?
No, that sounds like someone reading a lot into that book. Because those were all real churches at the time Revelation was written. So, I don't know. That seems like a stretch to me, but most interpretations of Revelation seem like a stretch to me. So,
Except Dave Matheson's.
even some of his, he's not a preterist like I am. But yeah, anyway, yeah. So to your question, I haven't heard that. But I'm not surprised because it seems like everyone who reads Revelation has their own interpretation of it. Yeah. So, yeah. It's interesting stuff. We could spend more time in end time apocalyptic stuff someday.
Yay.
But not today. So, yeah.
Let's get to the medieval.
So I know that one thing that I put, if you notice on the timeline, when I had this, it said 1054 question mark or 1204 question mark. Did any of you notice that? Well, here's why. I'm glad you asked. So during the Crusades, where should I start this? So let's jump ahead to the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade happens in 1204. They're doing the same thing most of the Crusades were doing, which was to go from Rome, from the Western Empire, and go east to try to save fellow Christians from the Turks, which is what they called Muslims. Right? So during the Fourth Crusade, they set out to attack Muslims, and then they get a message from, I should know this, I forget who it was. I was studying this so hard all week, and I forget who it was. I think it may have been the Bishop of Rome or one of the kings of Rome. Who is it? Edward Norton? Oh, I don't remember. But they get diverted and they actually go and sack Constantinople. You might be right. It might be the actor Edward Norton from Fight Club. I don't know. But they go and they attack Constantinople instead of reclaiming Jerusalem and fighting Muslims, right? So this is the moment in 1204 where you have Christians from the West going and attacking fellow Christians in Constantinople, aka the East, literally sacking the city of Constantinople and then carrying all their loot back to the West. So that's kind of when a lot of historians might say this is like the final nail in the coffin between the East and the West, at least for several centuries, because they are attacking them, they kill fellow Christians, and then after that, there's a big break. So this is why some people will give you the date as 1054, some people will give you the date of the split as 1204. Because, as I mentioned earlier, in the First Crusade, what's happening? You have the Bishop of Rome answering a call of help from the Bishop of Constantinople in the East, saying, hey, the Turks are attacking pilgrims, or the Muslims are attacking pilgrims, they're persecuting Christians, they're killing us for no reason, we need your help, can you come send some military aid, right? So the Crusades often get a bad rap, and there's a lot of history in the Crusades that should and deserves to get a very bad rap, okay? So we'll just say that up front. But one other thing I want to point out tonight is that we can't judge medieval ethics with 21st century mindset and ethics, right? It's easy to look at them and be like I said, those idiots, don't they know what they're doing? They're just killing innocent people in the name of Jesus, right? That's one way to look at it, and that's usually how the Crusades get presented. I want to kind of maybe give a slight defense for some of their actions, okay? So one is, I can't remember what I put all in my slides, but what happens is in 1095, the Byzantine emperor asked for help from Western Christians because the Muslims are violently oppressing them in the Holy Land, okay? So this is over 400 years after Islam begins. They've grown, they've become a dominant force in the Middle East, and they're beginning to be violent to the Christians in that region. So the Christians answer a call to go and help them and defend them and kind of push back the Turks from that region. It's not that dissimilar from saying like, hey, there's terrorists oppressing certain people in this city, can you come help rescue them? Most of us would say like, yeah, that's a logical thing to do. If you have people actively being violent and attacking people, you want to go send some military aid to help them out. Especially in this period when, remember, the Christian church is like this with the political power and the military forces. So, of course, the Pope, it's Pope Urban II, who holds the Council of Clermont in 1096, and he gets everyone really fired up. He gives like a lot of like really famous sermons to get people amped up to go, because think about it from their perspective. They're giving up their lives, they're leaving behind everything else to go and fight in a war that they think God is sending them on, because the Pope, the head of their church, is saying, God's sending you on this war. You think you're laying down your life for God. Like if you read, we have a lot of journal entries or letters that were sent or written by the soldiers going to fight in these crusades. And you read them, and you come away thinking these people are earnest. They genuinely believe that God is sending them on this mission. They're leaving their comfort and their life behind because God has told them to, and they're going and they might not ever come back and see their families again. So at least with the First Crusade, it in their minds, maybe not my mind, but in their minds, it seemed earnest and it seemed like a mission sent by God. Does that make sense? Does it seem kind of fair? Kind of fair? That they're going to rescue fellow Christians from these oppressive and violent Turks, right?
Do you know what
Well, yeah, because the Quran tells me so. No, because to be honest, I think that's a big part of it. Is the way that their religion spread is killing the infidels. Oh, you won't convert, you know. Like, keep in mind, the founder of Islam, Muhammad, led 86 battles in his lifetime. And that's just in the last, I think, 20-ish years of his life. He's leading 86 battles to kind of expand Muslim territory. And then immediately after he dies, the subsequent caliphates expand that even further. So that's kind of in, I'm really not trying to be like offensive, but it's kind of in the DNA of Islam. If your founder is a violent warlord, it makes sense that your religion is going to, like when people accuse Christianity of being just violent and warlike, I'm like, yeah, but look at the founders. Jesus didn't lead 86 battles. Jesus dies for his enemies. Muhammad beheads his enemies, right? Like there's a clear difference. Yes, Christians have messed up in the past. Yes, the church has really messed up a lot in the past, but Jesus didn't mess up. So if you compare Jesus and Muhammad, there's no comparison, right? So I don't think there's any Muslims here in the room tonight, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that Islam is based kind of on spread through dominance, through violence, through force. So, you know, there's obviously places where they coexisted. It wasn't all violent, but yeah, if you're asking why were they violent, I think that's part of it. Your founder was violent. Your founder was a warlord. So, yeah, that's just my thought. So one thing Pope Urban II said to get the soldiers to go and fight for him was he said, if you've killed anyone in the past, which is a mortal sin, here's how you can get an indulgence. This is where indulgences come on the scene for the first time. And I will forgive you, and you will be able to get into heaven if you go and fight this crusade for me. Okay? So put yourself in the mindset of a soldier. You've killed people in the past. You think you're going to hell because of it, or at least you're going to spend millennia in purgatory, right? And the Pope comes to you and says, hey, you want to get out of purgatory faster or get out of hell? Go and fight this holy war and rescue your fellow Christians from these, this horde of Turks and save them, and I'll give you an indulgence to cut short your time in purgatory and get you into heaven faster. So from the perspective of these soldiers, you can kind of see why they would go and fight. It's not just because they were bloodthirsty medieval Christians that had no clue. They genuinely had some motives for going to fight in the Crusades. Now, I will say, most historians will agree that the first one seems pretty noble, or as noble as it can be, and they kind of get crazier and crazier and crazier as they go on. To the Fourth Crusade, it's the Christians attacking fellow Christians, right? Killing the people in Constantinople, right? So that's kind of a very loose overview of the Crusades. Yeah, and then we have a map here. So if you want to look at the First Crusade, Clermont is right here in kind of the southern middle of France. So this is where Pope Urban gives his messages. He said, Deus Vult. And have you heard that term before? What does Deus Vult means?
God wills.
God wills it, right? So you literally have the Pope telling you, God wills that you go kill all these Muslims in the Holy Land. He probably didn't frame it like that. He framed it like rescuing Christians, reclaiming the Holy Land, the place where Jesus lived, pushing back the Turks. And then what they do here, you can see here, it says kingdoms established by the Crusaders. They established what they called Crusader states, where the Crusaders tried to maintain the land and kind of rule it. Those did not go well. They did not last long. But they basically were able to push back some of the Muslims for the First Crusade. And then there's a back and forth for a couple hundred years thereafter. But yeah, so that's roughly the Crusades for just over 100 years. 200 years. They go longer than that. Questions on that? I'll just briefly mention too, these are not the only crusades. I think when you say crusades, you think of Christians going to kill Muslims. But we also have the Northern Crusades, which never get talked about, which is so a little bit later on in the 11 to 1300s. So this is overlapping a lot, but a little bit later on, you have people going to the northern to evangelize violently, like the northern Germanic regions. So they kind of went from here and they go up here to the north, and that's like they're going to Russia and the what were they called? The Balts, the Finns, and the Slavs, as well as plenty of other people. It was kind of like how you think of Christopher Columbus coming to the States and evangelizing. Like, however those two were blended together, it's like, yes, it's political dominance, but it's also kind of spreading the gospel by force, by making these people become Christians. That kind of same idea. So we have the Northern Crusades going on in that similar time period as well. And then, during this time, we have the Fourth Lateran Council. Now, this is a very important council with Catholic theology, because this is where the first time they codified transubstantiation. So it's not until the 1200s that transubstantiation, they may have believed it way earlier, but it's not officially codified in a church council until 1215. So this is where transubstantiation becomes a thing. Now, I mentioned this earlier, or I hinted at it. How could this belief be used as a political weapon? Yeah, what do you think?
It could be like something that they only Catholics have, like they only have the real body of Christ. It's something special, so you have to kind of come into this force, this power group, so kind of like a power grab in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So next time when we talk about Luther, we're going to talk about how Luther really pushes back on the idea of transubstantiation for that reason, because you basically hit the nail on the head. If you go back to my analogy of the hose, right, or like vessels in the body, like blood vessels in the body, if the Catholic Church is the only people that have the real body and real blood of Jesus, they ontologically turn into those things when the priest blesses them, as only priests can do. This is what's called sacerdotalism, that only the priest has the ability and the authority to say the magic words and transform the bread and wine into the real body and blood of Jesus. Then if you cut that off from people, they can't access Jesus, they can't access grace, they can't partake in that, right? Kyler?
I did want to say that the idea that the bread and wine becomes the body and blood of Jesus goes back to like the earliest. So even St. Jerome, St. Ignatius, like the earliest writings of the church all say that. But transubstantiation is where it gets defined in the West as like how they describe that it happens. People are like, how can this be the body and blood? It still looks like bread and wine. And so through rationality, they say, well, it's transubstantiated, so it still looks the same, but it's actually made up. And so it's their form of trying to define what had already kind of been understood for like 1,000 years.
It also didn't, again, appear out of nowhere because it was biblically based through John 6 and through the history of understanding, the Jewish understanding of how the Last Supper was present and how it can be passed down. So there was an understanding from early theology that this was something more than just a symbol. Because Jesus says, you must eat my flesh or drink my blood or you have no life in me. In John 6.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just out of nowhere. They didn't just make it up.
Mm-hmm.
It was based very heavily on biblical understanding.
Yeah.
So just to that.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned this didn't come out of, this wasn't invented in 1215. It did exist far before that. And the Eastern Orthodox holds a very similar view. I just don't think they call it transubstantiation. Is that right?
Yeah,
But
ours is closer to the Lutherans, where it's like
consubstantiative?
mix of blood and wine,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
The blood and body, but
it's more mystical.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
language thing you hit earlier, like Latin and Greek.
Mm-hmm.
That's yeah.
Daniel?
In any of these understandings, is transubstantiation, is the Eucharist salvific? I guess is the question for both of you and you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is the Eucharist salvific?
So that, again,
But
yeah, go ahead.
so no, but it becomes a question of what is salvation, which is what you are going to get into. How are you saved?
Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. But, I think we'll get more into this next time because there you have a whole lot of things happen in the Reformation with this debate. Like there's this one scene where Zwingli, you guys know the reformer Ulrich Zwingli? Does that name ring a bell? He's probably the third most famous reformer. You have Luther, Calvin, and then Zwingli. And Luther and Zwingli, there's this one scene where they're having a public disputatio is what it's called, disputation. And they're debating the Eucharist. And Luther keeps saying, it is the body and blood, like it is, because this is before he comes up with his idea of consubstantiation, or underneath, the presence of Jesus is underneath the elements. And eventually Luther just writes on the table, this is my body and blood. And anytime Zwingli tried to say something, Luther would just point at the writing on the table, this is my body and blood, this is my body and blood. Like imagine arguing with someone like that, it'd be pretty annoying. But what you don't know is like most of us in this room are probably more Zwinglian than anything else. Because he was the one who said for the first time, the first famous person to really say that this is a symbolic representation of this is Jesus' body and blood. So that's from Zwingli. He's the one who first says that, and, you know, he's very influential, and we don't know who he is. But we all probably would agree with him more than anyone else. But you can see why the political take on transubstantiation could end up being very useful for the church in the Middle Ages. You guys kind of see that? How if you cut off, like this bishop or this prince or this priest is cut off, he can't give grace to everybody under him, the hundreds or thousands of people under him. So you can see how that could be used kind of as a political tool. Right? Do you see that, or is that confusing?
No, absolutely.
It makes sense. So this is why Luther, he wants to say that the body and blood is present in the Eucharist, but it's under, and also that the Roman Catholic Church is not the only place that Jesus is present in the Eucharist. So he describes Jesus as being at the table, but not on the table. Something like that. So yeah, again, what Luther is trying to do with a lot of his work is comfort people. You're not going to hell just because your prince got in a fight with a bishop, right? Like that whole thing. So at the Fourth Lateran Council, they required annual confession. That was where that came into being. It increased papal political power even more. And this is where he invents interdicts. Who remembers what an interdict is? What was it, Hannah?
Like giving bishop power?
No, that was at the investiture. Remember, it's I-I-I-I-S-I. Come on.
Regional excommunication?
Yeah, uh-huh. This is where you cut off the hose and no one further down in this whole region gets it. Yeah. So you can excommunicate entire regions at once. And they also here require Jews and Muslims to dress differently. So you can tell who's a Jew, who's a Muslim. So yeah, that happens early on too. It's not just the Holocaust. And this is kind of funny. At the Fourth Lateran Council, they prohibit clergy from concubines, drunkenness, having unofficial families, gambling, executing people, extravagant clothes, simony, and more. These are good things to prohibit your clergy from, right? But let me ask you, what'd you say, Tim? Why would they have to outline this, do you think?
Abuse of power.
Because it was happening. Yeah. You don't need to say, hey guys, no more unofficial families unless they're doing it. So if that gives you a sense of how corrupt the church had gotten by this point, I'd say, in my opinion, this is kind of the height of papal power, 1300s, as well as the height of kind of some of the church corruption. But this is also an attempt at reforming some parts of the church as well. The Reformation was not the first time that the Catholic Church, made an attempt to bring things back, rein things in, change things, and reform things. To their credit, they were trying to do that here as well. But they had this idea, sacerdotalism, which I mentioned earlier, the idea that if the right person who's been ordained as a priest says the right words over these elements, they do become the body and blood of Jesus, and everybody here can get grace, right? So it kind of became so systematized that some of the spiritual elements of it kind of take a back seat to the process. Does that make sense? Kind of. This person has been ordained. There's rumors, like Aquinas, and who's the other one? Menno Simons, the father of Mennonitism, the Mennonites. He says, I was able to go through church my whole life, become ordained as a priest, and never once had to open my Bible. Because they were going through the processes. They were going through something called the sentences, written by Peter Lombard. That's what they used to train the priests and the bishops. So it was possible to become a priest and to give people the sacraments and lead masses without ever having opened a Bible at this point in history. Pretty crazy, isn't that? Like, it seems crazy, but you can kind of see that if you study it more, it might not make sense from what I've said, but if you get more in depth, there is a logical flow to how they got there. But yeah, Teresa.
I'm gonna take a different look at this last paragraph than you did.
Okay.
Instead of saying that the church was so corrupt, this was a pretty natural, like everybody was doing these things.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, they were saying, no, you have to be held to a higher standard
Yeah.
than everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Not that they were all doing this and everybody else was behaving all the time, which makes them corrupt. But that this was everybody, people were going to the concubines. They were, having unofficial families, gambling, executing people, all of these things. It was a violent, very,
Mm-hmm.
very, I don't want to say immoral, but different standards.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're saying, nope, clergy has to be higher.
Right. Yeah. Totally. And that's what I was getting at when I was saying, like, this was a reform, right? He is trying to reform from within, from the top down reform. So I agree. Yeah, he is trying to say, like, you should be held to a higher standard. We have to stop these things. But on the other hand, they were doing these things. So, yeah, totally.
I think everyone was doing them.
Yeah, sure. I mean, pastors today of all denominations are still doing these things. That doesn't mean they should. But it just means that they are. Yeah, and then one of the other results of the Fourth Lateran Council is they launched the Fifth Crusade. And like I said, they got sillier and sillier as they went on, so the Fifth Crusade is not terribly historically important. But yeah, but the Fourth Lateran Council is one of like the big moments you want to, if you're doing a survey of like the Middle Ages, this is one of the moments. You have like the First Crusade, Fourth Lateran Council. It's a pretty landmark thing because a lot of these things are pretty hefty. Yeah. We'll do a couple more minutes and then we'll wrap. We got through a lot tonight. A couple important figures. Thomas Aquinas, he was the father of scholasticism. He's called the Doctor of the Church. He was one of those people who just got real deep into theology. He studied the Latin Vulgate, very in depth. He says himself that he doesn't know Greek or Hebrew, but he did write tons of pages on theology based on the Latin Vulgate. He also like I mentioned earlier, he's heavily influenced by Aristotelian philosophy. We don't have time to get into this tonight, but this, I think, is a huge reason for why he's one of the people who defines transubstantiation, the Eucharist. The way that he says it, if you remember Philosophy 101, he says the accidents of the bread and wine remain the same, meaning they still have the appearance of bread and wine. They still taste like bread and wine. They still look and feel like bread and wine. But their substance, what they are, metaphysically, ontologically, what they are, their being, is the body and blood of Jesus. So that's why it's called transubstantiation. The substance is what changes in that, while the accidents on the surface remain the same. Does that make sense? So that's kind of an Aristotelian idea. Aristotle would say that what something is contained within itself, as opposed to Plato, who says that there's forms outside of things that determine what they are. Anyways, we can talk about that another day. And then if you were at the retreat, I quoted Aquinas, because he writes all this great theology. He writes 5,000 pages. And 3 months before he dies, he has some revelation or some experience or some encounter with God. And he never writes another word for the last 3 months of his life. And he says, all that I have written appears to just be straw after the things that have been revealed to me. Yeah. So, I read that at the retreat. It's a really cool thing to be like, you could write 5,000 words of theology and then later have a real encounter with God and be like, whoa, like that was it. You know? So, it's a cool, interesting thing. Yeah, really interesting thing at the very end of his life. Yeah.
So is he further defining transubstantiation, or did he like redefine it, or have a different definition of what was already defined?
10 years earlier. Yeah, I think he kind of elaborates more on it. One of the interesting things, this isn't really your question at all, but Catholics, generally speaking, are going to lean much more Aristotelian with their philosophy. And evangelicals like myself are going to be more influenced by Plato and Plato's philosophy. Because Plato was the teacher of Aristotle, and Aristotle ends up rebelling against Plato because they disagree on ontology and metaphysics. And they get into the nerdiest fight ever. And, and so like to this day, you can tell how someone's theology is influenced. We probably aren't even aware of it most of the time. But when evangelicals or Protestants speak, we're probably going to tilt more Platonic, and Catholics are going to lean more Aristotelian in how they understand the world around them, philosophically. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I just know that he elaborates and he writes a lot about the Eucharist and the transubstantiation, because that is after the Fourth Lateran Council. So he probably helps define it later on and establish it more. Good question. Let me see real quick. Where are we at? Yeah, Andrew?
It's interesting, like you pointed out, with the Nicene Creed, trying to figure out with Jesus, like there's all that text about this is who Jesus was.
Uh-huh.
And same thing with the Eucharist, like this is Jesus.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of debate and argument kind of around, like Jesus constantly seems to be the focal point of needing a lot of definition and confusion.
Yeah.
But a very important part, obviously.
Yeah. Anytime that you're talking about something becoming something else and still being the same essence and substance, it gets confusing. Because that essentially is what the incarnation is, and that's also what a lot of the Eucharistic debate is as well. So, totally. Yeah, I can see the connection there. Yeah. Any other questions? We can save everything else for next time. I think this is moving more into the Renaissance period. We get into Dante's Inferno, all that good stuff.
Can you go back to the Crusade map?
Crusade map.
I'm just curious when Jerusalem, because this has Jerusalem under
Be down here.
Muslim lands until the Crusade, right?
Yeah, so pretty much this whole coast was, at least for a small period, a Crusader state, kind of loosely held by the Crusaders for a little bit after the First Crusade at least. But then, like I said, there's constant back and forth for hundreds of years. But yeah, so you can see there's the Crusader state. It looks like that loops in Jerusalem, at least at the time of this map. But it's kind of weird that they put the who it was held by on this map, because this changed over this time period. So it's not exactly, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just thinking about like the Gaza Strip and like conflict over there and how people, everybody claims that as their kind of spiritual hub.
I was going to say, it's a good thing they settled this once and for all, who this land belongs to. Yeah. Yeah. So we'll just wrap there, but before we completely wrap, any questions, comments, thoughts? I realized that I didn't give a single time to meet with your neighbors and discuss in small groups, but you can do that after we wrap. But anything else? Michael.
When's the next one?
The next one's in 2 weeks, but it'll be politics. My friends Danielle and Luke are coming in to kind of talk about how we as Christians should talk and think about politics. And then we'll do the Reformation in a month. So 2 weeks till politics, and then 2 weeks after that we'll do Reformation. So we'll get into what the Reformation is, what it isn't. We've kind of laid some of the foundation for what a lot of the theological and political tensions were kind of building up to the Reformation. And so we'll unpack a lot of what happens there and why that's such a powder keg moment in church history. Yeah? Sweet. All right. Well, thanks for coming, y'all. Get home safe. Feel free to hang out. We'll see you next time.